Okay, folks, I'm going to introduce Plato to you and go over some elements from the reading that are a little bit goofy. So I wanted to introduce them to you. Now, I really want to reiterate a couple of things about this. You don't need to agree with me. If you work closely with the reading and you don't agree and you have evidence to back up what you're doing, that's fine. Okay? But you need to obviously work with the reading some way. And to get your own understanding of it together. So I'm going to go through the Plato today, but I want to warn you ahead of time. Not everybody agrees with me. I'm not just talking about students, but I'm talking about good scholars. Most scholars don't agree with me. That's perfectly fine. And I want to go through a little bit of how it works. So, and let me show you a little bit where we are in the calendar. Let's get rid of all this stuff. We are right now on the 4th. That's today. You're going to read Plato, watch the introduction. That's what you're doing right now. I'm a little late getting this up, but I'll come back to that. And tomorrow you should summarize Plato. Now, one note I want to give to everybody is that if you get the summary done tomorrow, great. If you take an extra day, that doesn't matter. This was something I talked about in the introduction. As long as you stay close to what I have here for the calendar for when to summarize, when to hit the main topics and things like that, you're fine. So you should have summarized Lao Tzu yesterday, and if you get to it today, that's fine. And if you get it tomorrow, that's okay. So you want to keep on top of the readings so you know what's going on with these. And I'll come back to the the value system, the ideology, towards the end. And where Plato fits into the whole scenario. But I'll also go into a special issue at the end too. So just so you know, so tomorrow you'll want to summarize Plato. You will want to. Do you absolutely have to? No, it's not absolutely due by tomorrow. But overall, these due dates, finishing Plato by the 5th, it's a darn good idea. The due dates, the absolutes, are on the essays. And I'll go through that. And we'll be going through it in a bit. So you want to get through the Lao Tzu and the Plato in the coming days and make sure you're in good shape. So I apologize I'm getting this a few hours late, but let's go through it now, okay? So so today get through the introduction, and tomorrow write about it. But pay attention to it and write what you darn well please. So let me go through it for a bit with you. Let's get that out of the way. And here's Plato. That's him. And that's what they think he probably looked like. So, and look at him. He's kind of, an old guy. And we have statues of Socrates and other things. And now there are a number of problems with where Lao Tzu comes from, but they have a pretty dang good idea on Plato because people knew him in Athens. And there's a lot written about him by people who knew him, and it's all consistent. So that's something that's a little bit different about Plato, is we have a lot of more verifiable material on him. And I need to tell you, though, if you look at Plato's collected works, it's about this big. And I've got one at home. This actually is a book on biology. And this thing, they're about the same size. You could hurt somebody with this. You could defend yourself with this easily. You could take somebody out. It's 1,600 pages of very dense and difficult writing. And almost all of Plato's writings are in dialogue form, where people talk and go back and forth. And almost always the central person in the dialogues, almost all of them, but not all of them, is Socrates. And that's the case here. Usually Socrates is correct about things. Probably it seems that Plato, this guy right here, you're looking at him, it's not me, he seems to agree with Socrates. Does he, though? I gotta tell you, we're not sure. I used to think no, and a lot of people thought no. Gabler, I gotta forget his name, used to say no, and I used to agree with him, but I'm telling you, after reading more Plato, I think he probably does. But I'll tell you this, scholars aren't sure, but I'll walk you through the basic issues right now. So does Plato equal Socrates? Does Socrates equal Plato? Maybe. You're going to have to be the one to decide. You're going to see there's some problems with it. But he was writing somewhere around, 420 to 400, and he set up the first university in his time, and he was a student of Socrates. They knew each other, and he did teach he taught Aristotle, whom you've heard of. Plato did. Aristotle was a student at Plato's academy. And then a student of Aristotle's was Alexander the Great. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. So you have a line from Socrates to Plato, and they knew each other. They did. We have it from multiple sources that they did. Plato even says it. And Plato taught Aristotle. And there was tension between Plato and Aristotle. Okay? I think there is tension between Plato and Socrates. But I'm not 2,500 years old. I didn't know them when I was growing up. We don't know. So, as best you can tell, it doesn't mean it's in anything goes. We're going to do our best and try to figure it out. You do have the Benjamin Jowett translation. He wrote a lot of translations from way back when. And this was one of the old translations I have. What you have is a selection called The Allegory of the Cave. It's probably the most famous passage, not just in Plato, but in all of philosophy. It is extremely influential and extremely well known. This is a passage from the Republic, which is Plato's book. He wrote this, and Plato's Republic is part of his collected works, which is massive. And I'm telling you right now, it is very sophisticated. And this is a passage from this, okay, from the Republic. So you're reading a small selection from the Republic. And I'll come back to these. This is Odyssey and the Iliad. And if I get a chance, I'll throw them at some people if they walk in the door. So don't tell them, okay? Let's walk through this. So again, this was written around, I'm guessing 420, 400 BC. And this is going to the front page. And the character of Socrates. Now remember, Plato wrote this dialogue. And he never steps forward and says, he doesn't step forward and explain it all. He has Socrates argue with other people, and in almost all of the dialogues, the figure of Socrates is more intelligent and dominates the discussions. That does not necessarily mean he's right. He just dominates it because he can dismantle everybody else's arguments, and that's what he does here. Glaucon isn't the sharpest guy in the sharpest tool in the shed. He just says, "I see, I agree," and whatever. So that's the way it works. And so you get the philosophy out of this by dismantling and taking apart it from Socrates. Could Plato occupy a different position from Socrates? Yes. Does he? Maybe. Okay. I'm going to try to let you see that. So this is Socrates from a passage in the Republic. And I'm just going to go through the first few pages of this and set up the issues, and you're going to see how it's going to play out, and we're going to come back to ideology. And now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. He says, I'm going to show you in a figure whether or not we are enlightened and we know stuff, or we're dumb as a box of rocks. Okay. Behold human beings living in an underground cave. He's just telling you, look at this, imagine this, and that's what he does. And this is a weird thing. And this is called, and I won't go through this whole passage, but this whole section you have, what I've taken here is known by contemporary philosophers as the allegory of the cave. Now, an allegory is, I tell you story A, B, C. You understand reality 1, 2, 3. That's what an allegory is. It's a longer story to demonstrate, not prove, but demonstrate a more sophisticated idea. You might think it's a metaphor that's been blown up and larger. That's what allegories do. They follow a sequence. And even though Socrates is telling you this, he's trying to instruct you in that. That's what he does. And he tells you that partway through. That he says, you'll see, my friend Glaucon, that this is an allegory. So he says to imagine, if you can, and it's essentially a group of people tied down into a cave. But notice what he's doing. And he's having them look at shadows on the wall. So they're sitting there tied down, and they're looking at shadows on the wall. And what they do is they think those shadows are real. They've been there since they were this big, maybe this big. They've been there their entire lives, their entire conceptual lives. They've been figuring it out based on shadows. And watch what he does. And he says, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets, they start to think that the shadows of the puppets are the reality, and that's what they start to believe. He says, now and look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error, if they're shown the reality. So somebody grew up watching cartoons and then suddenly, bang, they get thrown into reality. So that's what's happening to them. So they've been in this shadow world the entire time, and they've been physically forced, to live in that shadow world and grow up under it. Okay? And watch what he does in the second sentence. And so now they're shoved into reality, and I want to point out here that it's a bit of a violent shove. That the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. It's taken away in a fairly aggressive way. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which his former state he had seen in the shadows. Now, this brings up a very important notion within Plato, is that there's an idea of forms. So you have and behind Plato is hierarchies. Okay, and it's not just hierarchies. There's a king up top and royalty underneath him, and it's not that simple. It runs deeper. It's in the mind. The mind works by a hierarchy. So you might remember that what you have, when you have a more conservative ideology, is you have a hierarchy. You're going to have somebody in charge ruling somebody else's show, telling them how it works. And that is the nature of a conservative ideology. You have a hierarchy, and they defer to the one in charge, and they'll show the ones that are lower how to do things. That hierarchy in Plato is built not only in society with a king and people who follow him or her, or the king or queen, but it's built in the mind. Okay, you have a hierarchy within the mind, and what do you have? You have an ideal world, and then you have the real world, and then you have the shadow world. So the shadow world is twice removed from the ideal. And that's how he builds this hierarchy of thought within the mind. You have the ideal world, which is obviously the best, and then you have the real world, which is a replication of the ideal. Okay, so the people often say, "Oh, I deal with the real world," and as if that's the best. What Socrates is going to argue is that no, it's not the best. The ideal is the best. That there's always one ideal of everything, that in the real world you have multiple replications. So somewhere in the ideal is an ideal book, but in my office are replications of books. So you always are once removed, and the real is not the ideal. But then in the fictional world, in the shadow world, you have a representation of the real. It's a reflection of it just as much as the real is a reflection of the ideal. In the ideal world, you have singularity, and in the real world, you start to have replication. And in the fantasy world, or in the fabricated world, you have endless replication. That's the most degraded level in Socrates. Okay. So let me go through this. So the glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities for which his former state he had seen in the shadows. So if you take somebody out of the shadow world, and I should repeat this, you have the ideal, the real, and the shadow world. Okay, in the shadow world, you have replications of everything. You have images of things. A shadow is an image of the thing. Okay, so is a painting. Okay. So is a poem about a thing. That's a replica. It's not the thing itself. The poem, the movie, the picture, the shadow are all replications, are all part of that third world. Okay? If you grew up in the shadow world, you're going to have a hard time in the real world. Okay? You are. That's what it is. the glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities for which his former state he had seen in the shadows. He would prefer to live in the shadow world, obviously. And notice what Socrates does here. And if he is compelled to look straight into the light, and he confronts somebody with the light here, this is all one big long allegory. Will he not have pain in his eyes, which will make him turn away and take in the objects of vision, which he can see, which he will conceive in reality clearer than the things which are now true to him? If you grew up in the shadow world, you're going to have a hard time in the real world, and you're going to want to go back, is what he's saying. That people come from the shadow world, go into the real world, are going to be distressed by the light of the real world. They're going to want to go back. Okay? So he will want to return to the shadow world and not deal with the stress of the real world. He will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. So that's what he's doing in his allegory. If you're going to come out of this shadow world in which where we chained them, and we move that person to the real world, he is going to have both a physical and a mental and an emotional distress. It's physical, it's mental, and it's an emotional distress. He is not going to like it. His eyes are going to want to push him back in. Mentally, he's not going to really know what he's dealing with. And emotionally, he just wants to get out of here. He's angry. So notice the resistance to move up one level. Okay? And what he does later on, in a slightly later passage, he tells the reader, this is Socrates tells Glaucon, this is all an allegory. And what I want to tell you is I, as a philosopher, philosophers have knowledge of the ideal, when you have knowledge of the real. And I am trying to pull you up to the ideal, and you're resisting me. So that's what's happening. So as somebody who comes from the shadow world will resist going into the real world, when he talks to somebody in the real world, you're going to resist moving into the ideal. So he puts 3 levels within the mind for the way we understand how the world works. So we always have the ideal. We have an ideal idea of a book in our minds, and it's not this one, because this is a real book in its mind. So this is a real book. There are replications of these, but they're real. Okay. Then you can have pictures of these all day long. Those aren't even real. Okay. 3 levels of reality. That's a hierarchy that exists in the mind. So coming back to our political ideology, Plato falls within the conservative realm. He sees an ideal being better than the real, but he sees the real better than the shadow world or the replication. So wherever you see replications, you get 2 levels removed from the ideal. The real world is 1 level removed from the ideal. And he always sees the ideal as the light that you should follow for understanding. Okay? So that's what you see going on in Plato. So he is different than Lao Tzu, whom I'm arguing, but you can say otherwise. I argue that he's more liberal, but you're going to see a conservative nature in Plato. Most readers do agree that it is, but you can find liberal in there. Okay? And I also want to make you aware you can distort this a little bit. You can reread this. And again, I've gone through multiple interpretations as I've gotten used to Plato over the years. And I adore him. He's magnificent. So I'm going to hold Plato right there. I'm going to leave you with a good enough introduction, but enough that you can take it in your own darn direction as long as you are working with it. Okay? As long as you're working with it, you're great. And I should say many of the interpretations are really good. I look over them to see if you've done the reading and you understand it. And don't worry about whether or not I agree with you. Just try to get within a day or 2 of the due date, and that will keep you on course for the class. Okay? So the next reading we're going to do is Machiavelli. Okay? Is Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, he wrote during the Renaissance, and he is known as a straightforward conservative, the arch conservative, okay? Because he argues for a very strong leader who has, capabilities of strong, physical force. So he's put in the same camp as Plato, but I'm telling you right now, he's going to say something negative about this book. He's going to say something about how he's not going to talk to people who live in the ideal, who don't deal with the reality around them, and he doesn't. So he says some negative things about Plato, but from another conservative perspective. I want to emphasize you can have a liberal perspective from more than one position. You can do that conservatively too. But the ideology you're looking for in conservative is a centralized authority, okay? And it's usually built on hierarchies. In liberal ideology, because people are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, it's distributed, okay? People can figure out the situation on their own, and you'll see that in Lao Tzu. You don't see it in Plato. You don't see it in the figure of Socrates. You see a centralization of the authority, and it even goes as deep as the mind. You're going to see that played out in Machiavelli, and you're going to see it played out, liberal ideology played out in Wollstonecraft. Okay, so I see Plato as being more of a conservative. You can disagree. Now, I want to mention that you're going to see it with Machiavelli too, but it might be taken differently. Something I need to mention here is I'm going to be handing the class off to Leontine Jeffries. So I want to repeat now, I will be handing the class off to another faculty member who's a dear friend of mine, Leontine Jeffries. She's an excellent instructor, and she's taught this class before online, and she's worked with me extensively. She will be taking over the course. I was unfortunately in a bike accident, and I need to step back from handling this class. She is very capable of stepping in and taking it over, and I will be working with her, but she will be in charge of the class until November, I think it's about 3rd or 5th, okay, until the first week of November, and then I will be stepping back in. So she's the instructor, and she will work with you, and she is a highly capable and competent instructor and knows her Plato, and she'll work with you, okay? And so I'll work with her too while she's stepping in. But I wish you guys the best of luck. I will be around during the semester, but I'm telling you right now, the one in charge of the class is the one who makes the decision on whether or not anybody's added is Leontine Jeffries, okay? So she'll have a video coming up. She will not, as far as I know, be working with video throughout the semester. She will have other methods of working with you, okay? So I wish you all the best of luck, but I will be back in late November, okay? And take care of yourselves, and I think you guys will do great so far. But don't fret the little things on the little due dates. Work with Professor Jeffries, and she'll take good care of you, okay? All right, take care, guys.